Hello everyone and welcome to this video on exam skills for the historical environment aimed at the GCSE Normans AQA unit on the historical environment, which changes every year. This year we are looking at the Norman conquest and Wales. Note the phrase and Wales, not of Wales. So I reckon question of relationship between England and Wales, and especially what was going on in the border between England and Wales, is going to be really relevant to your question. The first thing we're going to look at is the mark scheme and what is required of you for this question, which is worth 16 marks in the exam. We are then going to brainstorm ideas about what could potentially come up as the question. Now, the historical environment on Wales is the only topic we know will definitely come up in the exam, but we don't know what the question will be. So by looking at past questions and looking at question stems, we can have a go seeing if we can guess the type of question at least that will come up. We are then going to focus in on two particular questions, looking at two particular historical concepts, especially in order to kind of see how the skills and knowledge you've learnt from this unit can be applied to a question. After this, we are going to use my what, how, why format to construct an answer. So first of all, let's look at the assessment objective. You can pause this video and actually read this in detail. However, the essential thing you need to know is it's worth 16 marks and it is testing your understanding of key concepts and key features of your study of Wales. This is my, in other words, summary. So there will be no source material required for this question. Instead, you will be assessed on your knowledge and understanding of Norman conquest and Wales. The idea being that it's not necessarily a conquest of Wales. You will also be assessed on your understanding of key historical concepts. Now, I think they will be change, continuity, significance, cause, and consequence, or consequence rather. And then you will need to refer to specific features of the site. Now, in the past, that site was an actual historical building. Now it is instead it's just a whole country. So within that, you're going to need to refer to precise features of a castle or castles in order to show specific understanding of Wales. For level 2, so in order to get half marks, this is for those of you who are aiming to get a grade 4 or 5, you need to at least write one paragraph that either agrees or disagrees with the statement. You need to use at least one precise piece of evidence to support that view, and you also need to explain why this evidence supports it. Note, many students attempt a second paragraph. However, unless both are fully developed, you will not get into level 3. So if you are short of time in your exam, the best thing you can do is focus on writing one solid paragraph about something you have learnt in this study. To push yourself further to level 3, you need to write at least 2 developed main paragraphs, one that agrees with the statement and one that disagrees with the statement. Everything you write will need to be relevant to the question, and you will need to provide clear and accurate evidence from a range of examples. And then it's quite tricky to get into level 4, but in order to do so, you need to provide a clear, strong argument backed up with clear evidence and reasoning. You also need to do this for at least one main argument and one counter argument. Ideally, you need to be writing 3 paragraphs, 2 in support and 1 in disagreement to the statement, or vice versa, and you need to show a range of evidence. So you can't just talk about one example. You'll need to talk about a range of examples from the study. Right, now we've talked about the mark scheme, let's have a look at some past questions. So you can see from this one, there's always some type of statement, okay? And then it will always say, how far does a study of support this statement? Explain your answer, refer to the site and your contextual knowledge. Now, you can see here the site is Castle Acre Priory, a building that you can go and visit, take photos of, study, etc. A little bit harder when your site is an entire country, okay? However, the same principles apply. It's just that you are going to be referring to more than one sites, plural, maybe more than one castle, for example, in your answer. This is another question. So, the main reason for castle building during the Norman period was to impress. How far does study of a White Tower support this statement? If you don't know the White Tower, I didn't know this until teaching this. That is the main tower, the main keep of the Tower of London. So, very iconic building. And dare I say it, much easier to talk about than the whole of Wales. But you can see there that the structure follows the same path. This is the last one that we had last year. So you can see how it's different. So last year they had Yorkshire as the site, and this is a question they gave, which I thought was quite a tricky, quite a challenging question. The main consequence of the Norman conquest in Yorkshire was a devastation of the countryside. How far does a study of Yorkshire after Norman conquest support this statement? Now, with something like this, you can refer to multiple sites within Yorkshire. So you need to talk about things going on in York as the main city versus the countryside, aka places like Warren Percy, which had been devastated by the harrying of the North. So you can see how a precedent has been set for this type of question where you're referring to more than one thing across a large geographical area. So these are the key concepts that they may use in your question. So cause, consequence, function and purpose, change and continuity. I'm sure you're all dying to ask me, what will the exam actually be on? What are they going to ask me in this question? And the only thing I can think is castles. The only thing I can think is whatever the question is, it must relate somehow to castles. Okay, whether that be the reason why castles were built, the consequence of castles being built, the function and purpose of those castles, the way that the landscape of Wales and the Anglo-Welsh border changed because of castles or continued in parts of, say, North Wales because of a lack of castles. That's the only thing I can honestly think has to be in there somewhere, whether it's explicitly mentioned in the question or it is implicit. It would be cheeky of them to have an implicit question, which is what they did with the Yorkshire question. The devastation of the countryside essentially means the harrying of the North, but they didn't use that phrase. So just bear in mind, a bit like with Yorkshire study, it has to be the harrying of the North, because that was the main thing the Normans did in Yorkshire. Was they used terror tactics, and they basically destroyed the economic infrastructure of Yorkshire. You've just got to bear in mind, whatever the question is on Wales, it has to do with castles, because nowhere in Europe, never mind England, did they build as many castles as they did on the Anglo-Welsh border. So whatever the question is, it must in some way link to castles. Okay, so we're now going to look at some possible question stems that I think could be on your question. So this is the one I took from the White Tower question. The main reason why William built castles was for, or was to. Okay, I think this could be the question stem, and then you've just got to apply that to your knowledge of castles in Wales. Be quite a straightforward question. These are the possible finishers. So, was it for trade? Was it for defense? Was it as a symbol of power? Was it as a military base? Now, regardless of which of those named reasons they use, you can then use the others in your answer. So you can, if it talks about trade in the main question, then you can still talk about defense and say symbol of power as your alternative argument. I honestly think military base is less likely to come up, just because I think some of the stuff to do with Norman expansion into Wales is quite complicated, quite difficult to grasp. I'm hoping they're going to be generous and ask you about either defense or as a symbol of power. This is a question stem I have taken from the Yorkshire question. So the main consequence of the Norman conquest for Wales was dot dot dot. So they could go with this question stem again, in which case we've got a couple of options as to what the rest of the question could be. It certainly won't be devastation of countryside, because he didn't really do that in Wales. Or I say he, as William, the Normans didn't really do that in Wales. So this is what they could potentially say is the development of towns or stronger trade links. Now, both of those link to the long-term function of castles as trading hubs, and the fact that towns grew around castles due to commerce and growth in the local economy. Intimidation of the local people, again, castles, and fear and symbol of power. Tighter control of the Anglo-Welsh border, that's castles and defence, castles being used as a method of defence. And then Norman expansionism. What I mean by that is the Normans going out into Wales to conquer more land. But don't forget, they didn't do that in a consistent manner. If they are going to ask this more tricky question, I would hope the end of it would be the development of towns or intimidation of the local people, as we seem to have a lot of evidence to support either of these. Okay, so what I want you to do now is think a little bit about specific reasons for castle building. And I want you to think especially, why did the Normans build castles on the border to Wales? 30 seconds, off you go. So I would argue that the main reason why William built castles was that the border between Wales and England was not fixed. It was called the Marches, so there was a very blurred line between where England ended and Wales began. As a result of that, you have banditry and border raids that were really common. It was a bit like the Wild West of lawlessness, where it was, easy for trouble to spill over the border into England, which is something William was keen to avoid. Okay, now I want you to think about, why were castles built, or how were they used rather, later on in the Norman period. So there are two key reasons. The first reason is that they were used as a power base for the Norman baron. Don't forget that William gave the marcher lords far greater power, and the second generation of Norman barons had very expansionist ambitions. They wanted to make a name for themselves in the sort of uncharted land of Wales. They were taking any opportunity, and therefore they needed the castles as a power base. The second reason is that they were used as a centre of trade. There is no point being the lord of an area if you're not going to make money out of it. Okay, if it's going to cost you money and you're going to be living in a drafty, old, leaky castle, you want to create you want that castle to be a magnet for local traders. It's the reason why so many of them were built on nearby rivers, on riverbanks, in order to have access to trade routes. Let's now have a look at the consequence of a Norman conquest on the people of Wales. So, what do we think that main consequence is? 30 seconds to think about it. So you could argue this in two ways. You could first of all say that the main consequence was a more secure border between England and Wales due to the number of castles that were built by the Norman lords, especially the marcher lords of William's reign. You could talk about how that reduced lawlessness and banditry. The second argument you can make is for the growth of market towns. This is an economic argument that towns grew around the castles built by the Norman lords, especially on the Anglo-Welsh border. Now that we have brainstormed some of the key themes and ideas, let's look specifically at two questions. The first one we are going to look at is as follows. The main reason why the Normans built castles was a symbol of Norman power. How far does the study of Wales and the Norman conquest support this statement? Refer to Wales and your contextual knowledge. Now, this could be worded slightly differently. So instead of a symbol of Norman power, it could be to impress, or it could be something like to appear powerful, etc. The idea is that they are a status symbol, that they are there to show that the Normans had more wealth, more might, a greater army than the native population. I am now going to model for you how I use the what, how, why model to write a fully developed and evaluative paragraph in only 6 sentences. This part of the model is to write one clear opening point. Try to keep this more general. Don't be too specific at this stage. So it's simply what about the appearance of the castles made them symbols of power. Got 1 minute to think about that question. This is my opening sentence. One reason why the Normans built castles was to act as symbols of power, since they were built on high ground and made from stone. The next thing you need to do is think about 2 clear pieces of evidence that will help you to show the point you've just made. To do this, think about the question of how can I use precise examples that support my argument. 2 minutes, off you go. this, I wrote the following. For example, William Fitzosborne built Chepstow Castle's Great Tower as a large stone keep to emphasise Norman wealth and power. Similarly, Hugh d'Orange used heraldry of a wolf on emblems which were displayed on castle gatehouses and banners to remind the people of who was in charge. So here we have two simple sentences that actually provide quite a lot of fact about the way in which castles were used to show wealth and power. Then you go on to do 3 sentences of explanation, considering why did the Norman barons use castles as a symbol of power. 3 minutes, off you go. For my 3 sentences of explanation, I have written, this was important for the Norman barons because they wished to assert their authority in a land that had a reputation for lawlessness and banditry. Talking of lawlessness and banditry, I've got 2 bandits here in the dining room right now, messing around. I do apologise for the background noise. Anyway, furthermore, William granted the Marcher lords greater power than the Norman lords elsewhere in England, so they would wish to exploit this. As a result, the Marcher lords acted like rulers in their region and used their elevated status to intimidate the natives into obedience. So you can see here 3 clear sentences that explains just how the Norman lords, the Marcher lords especially, wanted to use those castles as a symbol of wealth and power. And it's very specific to Wales because, of course, that is the region where William granted the Norman earls the most amount of freedom. Let's now have a look at a different question stem. So the main consequence of the Norman conquest was ... In this case, I'm putting the development of towns. How far does the study of Wales and the Norman conquest support this statement? Now, this is a harder question. I would say one paragraph on the development of towns, linking that to trade, and the castles being the centre of trade, and one paragraph about the Anglo-Welsh border and more security, less lawlessness on that Anglo-Welsh border would be sufficient, I would hope, if well argued, to get a good grade in this question. Once again, let's use the what, how, why model to craft a question on the named factor of development of towns. So we start with one clear opening point. What was the most significant change in Wales or on the Welsh border? 1 minute, off you go. For my one clear point, I have written this. The most significant long-term impact was the development of towns around the Norman castles. Note the phrase long-term impact. This allows you to then go on to talk about the castles on the Welsh border being a more short-term impact in terms of imposing control straight after the Norman conquest, whereas the development of towns happened over a number of decades. Now let's see if you can support this with two clear pieces of evidence. How can I use those precise pieces of evidence to support my argument? 2 minutes, off you go. For my two pieces of evidence, I wrote, for example, under the Earl of Hereford, towns grew up around the castles of Hereford, Monmouth, and Chepstow. Later, Cardiff grew up around the castle built there following William's visit in 1081, which contained a mint for the creation of money. So, in that sense, I've shown both a range of evidence, because I've mentioned 4 towns that grew as a result of the Norman conquest, but I've also explored Cardiff in a little bit more depth. Now we need to explain this in 3 sentences. So consider, why was this an important consequence for Wales? 3 minutes, off you go. So this is what I wrote for my 3 sentences of explanation. The Norman barons were keen to make money from the local area they now occupied, so the castles became local trade centres. This is why so many castles were built beside a river or estuary, which was the easiest way to transport goods. As a result, the population around the castle grew as people sought new trading and job opportunities until they became well-established market towns. So you can see here, I'm not adding any more specific evidence, but I am showing an understanding of the location of castles and how their location led to them becoming a centre of trade and therefore the towns, the market towns especially, growing around them. Phew, we're done. Well, if you are still listening now, please do congratulate yourself, give yourself a massive pat on the back. Well done, okay? Because by listening this far, you have certainly picked up the very best possible chance you have of grasping this historical environment ahead of both a mock exam and a real exam. So, I will keep you no longer. Cannot believe this is 41 minutes long. It's the longest video I've ever done. I do apologise. Well done for watching it, and keep practicing those model answers, because the more you practice, the better you will get.